Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you so much for being with us. In fact, I think this is a much more pleasant way to spend an afternoon since I think it's about over 100 degrees here in Dallas, Texas. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Barry Gewen, and it'll be moderated by our good friend, Talmage Boston. Let me thank all of the program sponsors, particularly Talmage Boston's law firm, which is Shackelford, Bowen, McKinley, and Norton. The Shackelford Law has been a very dedicated supporter of the World Affairs Council for a number of years, and we're very grateful to John Shackelford and all of the attorneys at that good firm. Let me also take this opportunity to thank all of the sponsors who have continued to support our webinars over the course of the last several months. And we've been hearing from you, and we're just so grateful to have your support. If you'd like to support our World Affairs Council, you can always do that by texting dfwworld to 44321. That's dfwworld to 44321. And I know that many of the viewers continue to support our programs by paying a fee anywhere from $10 to $100. And it really makes an enormous amount of difference to helping us meet our financial obligations, even though due to COVID-19, we are still not at our office. As always, I want to thank our strategic partner, InterraBang. InterraBangBooks.com. And that's the way you can order a copy of Barry's book, this recently published book about Henry Kissinger, The Inevitability of Tragedy, Henry Kissinger in His World. And the wonderful thing about going to InterraBangBooks.com is by putting in the code dfwworld, you get a 10% discount on all of your online purchases. I think many of you are well familiar, of course, with the platform. If you'd like to ask a question during today's broadcast, just write out your question, and Talmage Boston will be sure to work as many of them as possible into the conversation. Let me highlight two programs that are coming up that I hope that you won't want to miss. This coming Friday on June 12th at 4 p.m., you'll have the opportunity to talk with Clifford Krause. He's the energy correspondent for the New York Times. And I was just looking, in the price of West Texas Intermediate, I think now is back in the mid 30s. So as we all know, oil has been extremely volatile, and to have the opportunity to speak with Clifford Krause about fracking and all of the issues pertaining to oil industry right now will be very, very interesting. And then I want to tell you about a program that's taking place as well. Next Thursday, June 18th at 4 p.m., we'll be having a conversation with Secretary Robert Gates. And as you know, he has been an advisor and held high-level positions with so many administrations. He's got a new book that's coming out on June 16th, just 2 days before we have the chance to talk with him. The book's title is Exercise of Power, Americans' Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the post-Cold War world. I just started the book, and it's really remarkable about how he has chapters on Afghanistan, Iraq, Colombia, and without any hesitation, he says what he advised when it was right, when it wasn't, and really is one of the most candid books about post-war, post-Cold War diplomacy that I have read. So I know you'll be looking forward to having your conversation with Robert Gates. And now let me turn it over to Talmage Boston. But before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about Talmage Boston, who just rotated off the board of the World Affairs Council. He is an author. Nobody knows more about baseball as well than Talmage Boston. And he's a civil trial lawyer, as I mentioned, with the firm Shackelford, Bowen, McKinley, and Norton. And I'm happy to say that the first time that he met Dr. Henry Kissinger was when he had truly a privilege of interviewing with great skill Henry Kissinger. So Talmage, I look forward to sitting back and listening to your conversation with Barry Gewen.
Thank you, Jim. People who are on this webinar, to introduce you to Barry Gewen a little bit. For the last 30 years, he's been an editor at the New York Times Book Review. He's also written prolifically on politics and international affairs for the New York Times, the New Republic, and many other publications. Amazingly, with all the writing he's done, this wonderful new book is his first book. And it's gotten a lot of media attention, deservedly so. And the endorsements on the dust jacket come from the likes of Walter Isaacson, David Petraeus, Douglas Brinkley, and Sean Wilentz. So Barry, let me start off by just saying congratulations on a first book that is really making quite an impact among people who love international affairs. So with that as the introduction, let's go to the questions. Barry, in your prologue, you set up the contrast between Henry Kissinger and Condoleezza Rice, how the experience of their formative years, Kissinger growing up as a Jew in what became Nazi Germany, and Rice as an African-American in the segregated South, presumably inspired their perspectives on American foreign policy, with Kissinger becoming a pessimistic realist and Rice an optimistic idealist. So is one of your book's purposes to remind readers that American diplomats are real people whose foreign policy perspectives are naturally shaped by their life experiences?
I think it's, one can say it's inevitable that any diplomat, any individual will have his or her views shaped by their life experiences. But I do want to add, I think the contrast between the two of them is strong, and I do believe that it derives in large measure from their experiences growing up. But I do want to add that Kissinger has always been reluctant to have his biographers and other commentators look at his childhood for answers to why he has the perspective he does. And I think that's perfectly understandable. One doesn't want to reduce Kissinger's views of the world simply to the traumatic experience of the Nazis. That played a part in forming him, in forming who he is. But I think we have to look at his ideas on their own and not simply reduce them to his childhood.
Well, you also say in your prologue that Henry Kissinger has much to offer today. I think that's one of the many reasons your book has had the impact it's had, as a guiding light foreign policy thinker, but only if we know where to look. And your book tells readers where to look. So besides looking at Kissinger's upbringing in Germany and then in the United States, you also believe we should look at the world affairs thinkers who shaped him, in particular Leo Strauss, Hannah Arendt, and Hans Morgenthau. In fact, you devote 1/3 of your book to these three political theorists who impacted Kissinger. So what was the cumulative impact of the three of them on how Kissinger has viewed international affairs?
The impact is direct only in the case of one of them, and that's Hans Morgenthau. And I would say one, I think, cannot overemphasize the impact of Morgenthau on Kissinger's thinking. There was no thinker that Kissinger admired more than Morgenthau, who really became a mentor. He was, if I remember, 19 years older than Kissinger, but when Morgenthau was lecturing at Harvard as a guest lecturer, he spotted Kissinger, who was the brightest student in his class. They became friends, and their relationship went through many, many trends. So Morgenthau, as I say, is thinker more problematic in terms of their influence on Kissinger. I would say it's not so much an influence as such as a kind of family resemblance. What all of these German Jews had in common, and this is a point that I really think has to be stressed, is that they were in some sense conservatives. They were in some sense, and maybe this is less so in Arendt's case, nationalists. But of course, once the Nazis came to power, their conservatism, their nationalism had to be called into question. So what was left for them? None of them was a Marxist. None of them was a Zionist, even though they all admired Israel, defended Israel, but none of them chose to live in Israel. There were always tensions in that regard. And here, and I think the most important point for American readers, is that none of them was a liberal Democrat. And I'm using liberal in the broadest sense there, not as a partisan description, but in terms of a broad philosophical idea about how government worked. And the reason they were not liberal Democrats is that they saw what democracy had produced in Weimar Germany. And what it had produced was the most successful small d democratic politician in Weimar Germany, and his name was Adolf Hitler. So they always were skeptical, always had doubts about the virtues of democracy. When it worked well, it was wonderful, but it did not always work well. And so what I try to stress with Strauss and Arendt is not so much a direct influence, but a kind of family relationship. If you look at their ideas, if you look at their views on democracy in the world, you can see a lot of what Kissinger also thought, even though there was not a direct one-to-one impact. The same was not true of Morgenthau. There, the connection was much more direct.
Well, now, chapter 1 of your book is devoted to Henry Kissinger's views on Chile during communist leader Salvador Allende's 3-year reign in the early 1970s. Kissinger wanted Allende out, even though he'd been elected in a democratic election, because Kissinger did not want another Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. So a half-century later, knowing what you know about what was going on in the early 1970s, do you personally have a problem with Henry Kissinger's attitude toward Allende's Chile as he sought to maintain order and stability in our side of the world?
I personally do not. There's considerable discussion and controversy about what the US did in Chile. And if you want, I can go into that. I devote a lengthy chapter to that because there's a mythology that has grown up around the US actions in Chile that I try to dispel. But in any case, the reason that I focus on Chile and begin with Chile is that I think it is the classic example of what can happen when there's a conflict between a country's free and democratic elections and the threat that the outcome of those elections might pose to American national security. A more current example of this was when the Muslim Brotherhood was elected in Egypt. And that, I would say, was also a threat to American national security. So the point of the Chile chapter is to examine what the US should do if someone comes to power democratically who is in some way a threat to American security. That's the question that Allende and Chile posed, and that's a question, frankly, Talmage, that's never going to go away. There will probably be more examples of this. Does this mean we should rush in and overthrow that particular government? No, we should examine each case separately. But in the case of Chile, I agree with Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon that Allende did pose a threat.
Now, one of the challenges in analyzing Kissinger for any historian is that although he's been interviewed many times and he's written many books, what he said and what he's written is not always 100% accurate. He's a man of many faces. So how hard was it for you to sort through Kissinger's spoken and written words and discern which were truthful and which were wishful thinking, reputation-enhancing embellishments?
Kissinger declined to be interviewed by me. I can speculate about why that was the case, but I did not have a chance to sit down with him one-on-one. At the time that I was refused the interview, I was, of course, very disappointed. But when I thought about it, what I realized is that probably at most he would have given me an hour or 2 hours of his time. And the truth of the matter is, as you just suggested, that Kissinger embellishes. He's a good defense attorney and will present the best case for his own point of view, which may not be what comes through not only in his writings, but in documents, letters, and other studies of Kissinger. So I think not getting the interview was not detrimental to what I was doing. Now, in terms of your question about how one sorts through, I did it in the way that any historian or even journalist would do, which is to look at different documents, to compare what the documents have to say, what Kissinger has to say, what other players have to say. Let me take one example, and it's an important example. I conclude that Kissinger and Nixon's strategy in Vietnam was to find a decent interview for American withdrawal. And a decent interview could very well have meant selling out our South Vietnamese allies. Now, that's not something that Kissinger is ever going to concede. And in fact, he's contradicted that. He's tried to refute that view, that he wasn't pursuing a decent interval. But from my reading of the various texts and the various comments, I conclude that they were in fact looking for a decent interval, even if that meant the downfall of the South Vietnamese government.
Now, your book repeatedly depicts Kissinger's thorough knowledge of world history and how he's used it to guide his thinking in real time in the present on what's happening and what's likely to happen in the future. So did the unsound thinking that led to bad decisions by President Truman in Korea, Kennedy and Johnson in Vietnam, and Bush 43 in Iraq arise at least in part from their lacking the deep knowledge of world history that Henry Kissinger has?
I think the answer has to be yes. Let's stay with Vietnam. I don't really have much to say about Kissinger's views on Korea or on Harry Truman, but what I would say about Vietnam is that Kissinger, and here he is sharply contrasted with Hans Morgenthau, Kissinger in public always supported the Vietnam War, leading up to the time that he became National Security Advisor. Morgenthau was the great opponent of the Vietnam War. One of the remarkable aspects of their friendship is that it somehow survived this enormous gap in their views. And yet, Kissinger's view was not so different from Morgenthau's on this. He believed that getting into Vietnam was a disaster, and he wouldn't say it in public, but he did say it in private. And his students knew how he felt about this. But he was very critical of what the US had chosen to do in Vietnam. And in terms of his own perspective, which is a realist or realpolitik perspective, he felt it was a wasteful expenditure of American resources, blood, and money. And the effort he made was to find a way out of Vietnam.
Well, you devote one of your book's 7 chapters to Vietnam. And as National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under President Nixon, Kissinger took on the challenge of attempting to fulfill Nixon's campaign promise, which was to withdraw America's military from Vietnam while attempting to achieve a peace with honor. So was that goal truly a Don Quixote impossible dream?
I think one can say it was up to a point. What was the alternative to trying to achieve peace with honor? If the alternative was an immediate withdrawal, that was not only unacceptable to Kissinger and Nixon, but also profoundly unrealistic. In the comments that have been made about my book, the critics have generally gone after my arguments about Chile and Vietnam. And with the case of Vietnam, the argument is when Nixon and Kissinger took office, they should have simply announced a withdrawal, and that would have been it. And that would have saved 20,000 American lives and countless Vietnamese lives. But there was a problem with this. You couldn't, in any realistic perspective, you couldn't simply withdraw. And I give many reasons why that was not the case. And let me just give one actually minor reason, but crucial reason why a simple withdrawal wasn't possible. There were hundreds of American POWs in North Vietnam, and it would have been impossible for any American president, even President McGovern, to withdraw without getting an agreement on those POWs. And an agreement means an agreement between two sides, the US and the North Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese were not willing to talk about those POWs for at least a year. And I think it's not until 1971 that they were willing to make concessions on the POWs. That's only one small example of why an immediate withdrawal was simply not a possibility. It had to be a negotiated withdrawal. And for negotiations, you need two sides. And for a long time, you had only one side, the United States. The North Vietnamese continued to press for a victory. And as long as that was the case, it was almost impossible to arrive at any negotiated settlement. Let me add that there's a parallel here in our modern world to the Taliban in Afghanistan. What are we supposed to do in Afghanistan? Do we simply withdraw and leave our allies there to the mercies of the Taliban? If the Taliban are not willing to reach some sort of settlement, then we're stuck and we have to make a choice. The issues aren't as great as they were in Vietnam, where hundreds of American soldiers were being killed every week, but the intellectual structure is the same. You need a negotiating partner to be able to negotiate.
So having said that, Barry, if you had been in Henry Kissinger's shoes during the Nixon presidency, operating in real time then, and believing that the immediate withdrawal of American forces would have been disastrous to America's stature in the world, and without the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done differently? Is there anything you would have done differently than what Kissinger did during Nixon's first term?
I tell friends and people with whom I discuss the book that amazingly, after all of my work in investigating the Vietnam War and the Nixon-Kissinger role in the Vietnam War, I end up being agnostic. And by that, I mean, I don't know. I want to believe that we could have withdrawn faster than we did. I don't know if that's the case. And so I have to admit to a certain humility here. What I do think was a mistake, what I do think I would have opposed if I had been there and the subject had come up, was the bombing and invasion of Cambodia. Now, why would I have opposed that? Not because there wasn't a legitimate reason to do that. By allowing the North Vietnamese a sanctuary in Cambodia, we were putting our own troops at risk. The problem, however, was you couldn't look at it simply militarily, you had it politically. And by expanding the war into Cambodia, as we know, and as I think Nixon and Kissinger should have known, they were going to create even more civil dissent at home. Many people had said that the US was practically on the verge of a civil war because of what we were doing in Vietnam. And I think for political reasons, not military reasons, it was a mistake to expand the war into Cambodia. And if I had been around then, I think I would have been like one of those other advisors to Kissinger who heatedly opposed that expansion, and in some cases they resigned over it. So I will say that on particular steps that were taken, I might have differed, and I might have hoped that we could have found a way out somewhat faster than we did. But if the choice was immediate withdrawal and negotiated settlement, I was firmly on the side of negotiated settlement.
Now, during his 5.5 years of serving under President Nixon, Henry Kissinger's conversations with his boss, for the most part, were taped. So we have hard evidence of Kissinger's totally sucking up as a seducer to Nixon, and also his having to withstand Nixon's frequent anti-Semitic remarks. And that leads to the question that you raise in your book: what price should someone be willing to pay in order to be close to power? So are you satisfied with Kissinger's answer to that question?
In Kissinger's case, let me say that this was a point that both Kissinger and his mentor Morgenthau wrote about. And they both created the division. Is it better to be inside shaping power or outside criticizing power? And in both cases, they would have preferred to be inside shaping power. In Morgenthau's case, that proved to be impossible once he became such a vocal opponent of the war in Vietnam. Kissinger was much shrewder. Some would say he was simply being opportunistic, but his friend Morgenthau never viewed him that way, except to say opportunism is always a part of any public figure, but that wasn't the key to Kissinger's making the choice to remain in power. What I would say is that whenever it was a matter of personal outrage or pique, when Nixon would make anti-Semitic remarks to a man who had lost many members of his family to the Holocaust, Kissinger swallowed hard and stayed. He stayed because he thought it was more important to have his input on the conduct of foreign policy than simply to leave in outrage. But when the questions that came up were questions of policy, at those points, he would threaten to resign. And he did not, as we all know, but he would make the threat repeatedly.
Another one of our participants in the audience has asked a question I probably should have opened this session with, and that is for you to explain your title, The Inevitability of Tragedy. Where did you get that title? How does that tie into the comprehensive theme of your book?
The title comes from Kissinger himself, and I indicate that in an epigraph at the beginning of the book. And it has to do with the sense, again, of all of these German Jewish intellectuals, they had a profound sense of tragedy. They had lost family members to the murderers of the Holocaust. They had been exiled from their native land, thrust out unwillingly, and they could not believe that history was simply a matter of progress. For them, for Kissinger certainly, it was more like one damned thing after another, and what you had to do was channel and steer and adapt and maneuver in terms of the vicissitudes of history. And as you mentioned, I contrast Kissinger with Condoleezza Rice. Her own experience led her to the view that the arc of history always bends toward justice, because she had risen from this position of segregation to the very pinnacle of American officialdom. In Kissinger's case, his view was much darker. He understood that there were tragedies that were irredeemable, that simply occurred, and you had to accept that that was part of what history was about. And so the inevitability of tragedy is the view that there's no escaping tragedy. There's always going to be the possibility of tragedy in what you do, and especially since statesmen are operating without full knowledge, operating in the dark, lives will be lost sometimes for mistakes.
Well, along those lines, Henry Kissinger was not a government insider when Presidents Reagan and Bush 41 brought an end to the Cold War, the most defining moment of which was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So did the fall of the wall result in America's recommitting to Woodrow Wilson's idealism, that our foreign policy should be aimed at making the world safe for democracy?
I would say that that's a strain of American thinking that never goes away. We can talk about Reagan and Bush and the fall of the wall, but if you go back to Jimmy Carter, he too was pressing for universal human rights and an expansion of democracy around the world. He too was a Wilsonian. Wilsonianism, which in some ways is the opposite of what the realists like Kissinger and Morgenthau believe. Wilsonianism was for them an enemy that had to be fought. One couldn't simply go around the world trying to impose one's own ideals on a recalcitrant reality. One had to take into account the realities of power and the configurations of power. And so I would say, no, it wasn't that Reagan and Bush brought about a revival of Wilsonianism. It was that Wilsonianism never went away.
Well, regarding President Reagan, who famously was adamant about not wanting Henry Kissinger to be his Secretary of State as Gerald Ford had wanted, but you say that once Reagan became president, he actually reasserted Nixon-Ford strategies, which were in fact Kissinger strategies, although he expressed them, you say, clothed in Wilson's rhetoric, that Reagan's East-West dialogue was actually like détente, that his actions were softer than his rhetoric. So in terms of trying to understand why Reagan in fact acted differently than what he had said in his campaign, isn't a large part of that because Reagan's most influential advisor throughout his presidency was James Baker, who had a very pragmatic approach to foreign policy that was much like Kissinger's?
I don't know enough about the inner workings of the Reagan administration to know what the influence was. We can point to James Baker, but we can also point to George Shultz. And both of those men were pragmatic, and often pragmatic in a way that Reagan was not. If you remember the famous summit with Gorbachev, Reagan was all set to try to abolish nuclear weapons, and his advisors had a fit and had to pull him out of that. I mean, to that degree, Reagan was very much a Wilsonian idealist. But as Kissinger says in his books on foreign policy, Reagan was, for all of his idealism, a pragmatic, reasonable man who would not push too far and had a tremendous instinct for what the limits were. Kissinger says that when Reagan was running for president, he savaged Kissinger, and that's Kissinger's word, savaged him. And that's true. And when his supporters at various points said, are you going to bring Kissinger into your administration? He was adamant in denying that that would ever be the case. So he did draw this chasm between himself and Kissinger. And yet for all of that, what Kissinger saw once Reagan was in power was a much more pragmatic statesman than he had led on. And Kissinger had an enormous admiration for what others might see as hypocrisy, because Reagan was able to accomplish things that he could only do if he presented himself as a Wilsonian. Now, what Kissinger goes on to say is that the Reagan years don't offer us lessons for the future for a whole variety of reasons, that they were rather an admirable sunset to American foreign policy at that time. And so Kissinger is critical of the people who feel that they donned the Reagan cloak and are continuing his policies. And the people in particular that he's critical of in that regard are the neoconservatives.
Barry, congratulations on the publication of your book. So again, Talmage, thank you. Barry, thank you. Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you again very, very soon.